I'd like to welcome you to Birkbeck this evening. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism here at Birkbeck. And it's a great pleasure this evening to be able to introduce our speaker, Professor Dan Stone, who is Professor of History at Royal Holloway in the University of London. He's a prolific as well as a brilliant historian and the author or editor of 15 books and some 70 articles on themes such as racial science, eugenics and genocide. His most recent publications include The Liberation of the Camps, The End of the Holocaust and Its Aftermath, which was published last year. Goodbye to All That, the story of Europe since 1945, which was published the year before last. And The Holocaust, Fascism and Memory, Essays in the History of Ideas, which was published the year before that. You can see a pattern emerging here. And this evening, he will be talking to us about race theory, anthropology, and the Jewish connection. This lecture this evening is one of a series which we are holding here to run alongside the Blood exhibition at the Jewish Museum in Camden here in London. The exhibition opened on the 5th of November and it will end at the end of February. It's an exhibition which was conceived by the Jewish Museum in collaboration with the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, specifically in collaboration with myself and Professor Anthony Bale from the Department of English and Humanities here. And in connection with that, at the back of the auditorium this evening, as you came in, you will have seen a pile of books. The book, which is piled up there, is entitled Blood, Reflections on What Unites and Divides Us. And it was produced by the Pears Institute to accompany the exhibition on blood. It's edited by myself and by Anthony Bale, and it gathers together a series of 7 specially commissioned essays from leading scholars. The essays reflect on the religious, historical, literary and medical dimensions of blood, and it is yours for the price of $4.99. If you, at the end of the evening, you can buy a copy from Jan Davison at the back of the room on the right. And I may even plug it again before you go. But the interval between these advertisements is going to be provided by Professor Dan Stone and his lecture.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. And despite the impression that David might have given you about a book a year, actually this research is something that I started well over 10 years ago, and with the intention of writing a small book on British anthropology and the Jews, which I have never done. So maybe being invited to give this lecture will be a kind of a reminder that I ought to complete it. Well, I wanted to explain really why it is that from the start of its emergence as a discipline in Britain, the Jews formed part of anthropology's considerations. This was largely in the early 19th century because of the dominance of religious and biblically informed understandings of the world, with their special place reserved for the Jews. Although the first anthropological societies, the Aborigines Protection Society, the Société Ethnologique de Paris, and the Ethnological Society of London, all devoted themselves primarily to savage races, the interest in understanding racial difference and racial origins that informed the work of ethnologists and anthropologists from the start meant that they all turned, even if in passing, to the question of the Jews. This remained true after the 1850s, when a more strictly physical and often more harshly racial approach to human differences emerged. The ethnological societies became anthropological societies, and the debate over human racial origins split between monogenists and polygenists, those on the one hand who believed that, following the biblical story of creation, all human beings had a common human ancestor, and on the other, those who believed that the different human races were separate species stemming from different creation origins. Once again, the Jews were marshalled in order to back up the arguments of both sides. Although on the face of it, evolutionary theory should have brought to a conclusion to this monogenesis, polygenesis debate, at the same time as it led anthropology to abandon its biblical framework, it did not put an end to an interest in elucidating and justifying racial differences, which remained the main concern of British anthropologists just as much as their counterparts in Germany, France, or America. Rather, evolutionary theories gave race science a new boost in the late 19th century. First, scholars who were evolutionists, and therefore ostensibly monogenists, often revealed the extent to which earlier polygenetic assumptions continued to influence their way of thinking. Second, evolutionary theory itself, despite positing a single origin for the genus mankind that most scholars now accepted was fully fertile, that's to say all human beings could interbreed, they set up new defences of old hierarchies, as anthropologists sought to explain how certain races had evolved into higher forms than others, as evidenced by their creation of superior civilizations. Once again then, thanks to their longevity as a group and their putative racial purity, the racial origins of the Jews became key to the discussions. It's important to set these discussions about the Jews into a broader context in order to establish their true import. I don't want to exaggerate the significance of the Jews to race theory or to anthropology. We should be clear about the fact that although Jews were seen by many thinkers as foreigners, they were rarely discussed in the same way as primitive or savage races in far-flung places of the world. Jews, for example, were not regarded as close to baboons, as were the Khoikhoi, the Hottentots, who lived near Africa's Cape of Good Hope. In a typical passage, Sir Joseph Banks, following his visit to the Cape on board Captain Cook's Endeavour in 1771, wrote that Hottentots, quote, are generally represented as the outcast of the human species, a race whose intellectual faculties are so little superior to those of beasts that some have been inclined to suppose them more nearly related to baboons than to men. Nor were Jews considered to be a disappearing race. In his 3-volume essay on the origin and prospects of man, from 1831, for example, Thomas Hope wrote that in the island fastnesses of Borneo and Sumatra, and over the islands of Polynesia, still rove, perhaps entirely to disappear from the globe, tribes of which the resemblance to the baboon is most striking, the superiority to the brute in mind and body least perceptible. The trope of the disappearing race remained a common one throughout the 19th century, as colonial atrocity was dressed up, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes not, as the natural order of things, the stronger necessarily replacing the weaker. The Jews were normally discussed neither in terms of primitiveness nor in terms of their propensity to disappear, for they were not regarded as a primitive race in the manner of the Khoikhoi or Australian Aborigines. But neither can their place in the anthropological debates be regarded as purely theoretical, an example of what Mitchell Hart calls the unbearable lightness of Britain. The question of the Jews' racial origins, though clearly of paradigmatic theoretical importance, assumed an importance disproportionate to the size of the Jewish population in Britain for other reasons. For example, the short-lived 19th century religious enthusiasm for the notion of the Jews as the spiritual forerunners of Anglicanism, this craze for the British, the Son of Man, as a kind of sign that the British had been somehow blessed with this connection. Thus, almost all serious general studies in anthropology from the moment of the discipline's founding in the mid-1800s onwards included some discussion of the Jews' racial origins, where John Ephron sees the passing and exemplary discussion of the Jews in certain works as proof of the somewhat lackadaisical English attitude towards the country's Jewish subjects, as he puts it. I regard these analyses as driven not by an anti-Jewish animus, but by the sense that the Jews were a problematic case. They were a kind of test case for anthropology in general. Their presence in these texts is not mere accident, but a result of the fascination that British anthropologists felt for the Jews. For example, the founding text of modern British anthropology, James Cowles Pritchard's Researches into the Physical History of Man, first volume 1813, was largely devoted to explaining the need to research the various savage races. Pritchard famously argued in favour of the unity of the human race, largely on philological grounds, though many readers found in his presentation of such a variety of human types evidence to the contrary. In the first edition, Pritchard noted that the example of the Jews has been much insisted upon in the debate concerning the effect of climate on skin colour, where the argument ran that although they, quote, are descended from one stock and are prevented by their religious institutions from intermarrying with other nations, yet it is said that they have acquired the complexion prevalent in every country into which they have been dispersed. But Pritchard considered this claim to be false, arguing that in fact the Jews, where they have not mixed their stock by intermarriages with the indigenous people, have in no place varied considerably from their primitive complexion. He provided a number of examples given by various travel accounts, proving that the Jews are born white with black hair, so that, quote, the Jews who are scattered through these countries, by which he means Syria, Arabia and Barbary, are equally with the other inhabitants born white, and remain so until they sustain the influence of a hot climate, from which they acquire a deeper hue. Even in the case of the two sorts of Jews in Cochin on the Malabar coast, Pritchard argued that those known as the white or Jerusalem Jews have, unlike the black Jews, kept their race distinct, whereas the latter are a mixed race and are looked upon as an inferior caste. The example of the Jews, then, might be almost sufficient to show that the white complexion will be permanent during any length of time, for we find it subsisting perfect in the midst of the blacks of Malabar, though exposed to the darkening effect of an Indian climate during almost the whole Christian era. But Pritchard, who continually expanded his work as new information reached him, modified the short section on the Jews' physical characters in the third edition of his book in 1844, so 30 years later. In a contradictory passage, Pritchard began by asserting that, quote, the Jews have assimilated in physical characters to the nations among whom they have long resided, though still to be recognised by some minute peculiarities of physiognomy. For example, he noted that in Northern Europe, Jews are fair, or xanthous, whereas the Jews of Portugal are very dark, and the Jews of Cochin are so completely like the native inhabitants in their complexion that Dr. Claudius Buchanan says he could not always distinguish them from the Hindus. However, he had not entirely changed his mind in the 30 years since the first edition of his great work. He ended this section on the Jews by asserting that it was unlikely that the Jews of India or China had intermarried with the local inhabitants. Otherwise, there could be, according to Pritchard, no accounting for the fact of the Jews' survival as a discrete group. Quote, it is probable that the preservation of the Jews in these countries as a distinct people is owing, as elsewhere, to their avoiding all intermixture with the native inhabitants. Here, although the distinctness of the Jews and the influence of climate are still insisted on, Pritchard was rather more hesitant about the extent to which the Jews differed from the populations surrounding them. Indeed, his conclusion was adumbrated in the first edition of Researches, where he claimed that the black Jews of Malabar, unlike the white, had intermarried with the natives. Many other authors took up the discussion, seeking to clarify Pritchard's confusion. They tended to note that it was highly improbable that the Jews had been influenced solely by climate and not by intermixture. John Beddoe, for example, in the first text in English racial science specifically devoted to the physical anthropology of the Jews from 1861, tried to find a middle way between the Jews of Pritchard, which ascribed the multiplicity of Jewish traits to climatic conditions, and those of Paul Broca and George Glidden, which, according to Beddoe, ascribed the Jews' various traits solely to admixture of alien blood, at least to admixture subsequent to the dispersion of the nation. Beddoe, one of the founding members of the Ethnological Society of London, and later president of the Royal Anthropological Society, argued that the unexpected appearance of redheads throughout the Jewish population, and not just in Northern Europe, suggested that the Rufus type, as he put it, must have existed among the Jews from the earliest ages, and to have belonged to the original Israelite stock as distinguished from the Syrian. Irrespective of this disagreement, both Beddoe and Broca concurred that the Jews were racially distinct. Broca argued that the Jewish race, scattered for more than 18 centuries in the most different climates, is everywhere the same now as it was in Egypt at the time of the pharaohs. And when Beddoe presented his famous Index of Nigrescence, this was a formula for identifying the races of Britain. You have to see the text to believe it. He has this formula worked out to identify gradations of colour, skin colour, according to the populations of the British Isles. When he presented this famous index several years later, he confirmed the working assumptions of his work on the Jews, claiming that the colour of the hair is so nearly permanent in races of men as to be fairly trustworthy evidence in the matter of ethnical descent. The existence of red-haired Jews, according to Beddoe, meant neither that climate changed the Jews' physiognomy, nor that they had intermarried with the surrounding population, but simply that red-haired types were part of the original makeup of the Jewish people. As Pritchard's ethnological descriptions multiplied, so the vulnerability of his thesis concerning the unity of the human race increased. His portraits of the world's various peoples were so poignant and compelling that many readers felt that their author could not see the wood for the trees. Such a wide variety of peoples could never have developed from a single ancestor. Hence, the emergence of the view that humankind was made up of several distinct species or races. Over time, the ethnological approach, that's to say, the descriptive approach, a kind of celebration of the different characteristics of people, simply describing them, tended to give way to the anthropological approach. That's to say, being replaced by a supposedly more scientific analysis into physical characteristics and racial origins. A notorious, and also it should be said, a not very representative case is Robert Knox's The Races of Man, 1850, a book that's often appealed to because it signifies more than any other this shift from ethnology to biological racism, which is true, but I think we should also bear in mind that it wasn't a typical text of its period. This was not, I think Knox didn't represent common opinion when he published this book. Knox, a brilliant anatomist at the University of Edinburgh, until he was caught up in the Burke and Hare scandal of 1829, in which he was alleged to have been buying corpses for use in anatomy classes from the two murderers, made a living as a translator of foreign medical texts in London. According to Ephron, Knox's The Races of Man is not only the first biology of cultural despair to be penned in Europe, it is also British race science's first sustained and comprehensive attempt at describing the physical appearance of the Jews. Knox's basic position was that there was an absolute distinction between the Jews and other races, especially the superior Saxon or Celtic races. Jews, he maintained, had been wandering over the earth, trafficking in cast-off garments for centuries. They were uncultivated and unable to form a nation. Most important, Jews were physically distinct from Europeans. The purest of the Jewish race, Knox wrote, is a dark, tawny, yellow-coloured person with jet-black hair and eyes seemingly coloured. There is no mistaking the race when pure. It is Egyptian, that is, African. And in the supplement to the second edition of 1862, Knox added that these palpably different races of mankind are entitled to the name of species. The polygenist position was no more satisfactory, however, in explaining the similarity of the Jews to the populations among whom they lived. A clear example comes from the United States, where Josiah Nott, later with George Glidden, co-author of one of the most influential American books on race, argued that the question of the racial origin of the Jews affords many instructive lessons to the philosopher. In particular, he asked, what light does it shed on the question of the common origin of the human species? Although ostensibly about the Jews, however, the aim of Nott's article soon became clear. In the American context, the question of the Jews was of secondary concern. And I quote, "If this race, i.e. the Jews, has thus preserved its type unchanged for 4,000 years, and under all known influences which could change a race, it follows, as a corollary, that no physical causes exist which can transform one race into another, as the Negro into the white man." Chiding Pritchard, in his great work, as he put it, for not being clear on this point, Nott argued that the features of the Jews remained the same, even if their complexions changed with the climate. The black Jews of Malabar were, according to Knott, converted Hindus, as were the Falashas of Abyssinia. Races did not mutate into one another, but remained distinct. Thus, this defence of polygenism made use of ethnological writing on the Jews in order to arrive at its real point, the justification of slavery. Not every race, Knott claimed, deserved liberty. Rather, reckless experiments, such as emancipation, that go against the obvious laws of man and nature are doomed to fail. By appealing to the example of the Jews, Knott also proved that Negro slaves were a separate race from their masters. Darwinism, as I already noted, might, on the face of it, have eradicated the idea of polygenesis, but in fact it engendered new problems of racial differentiation and survival, and of the qualities needed and produced, but how, in order to facilitate these processes. A typical example of British social Darwinism was the 1895 book Darwinism and Race Progress by John Berry Haycraft. The book was a significant early statement in favour of Galton's eugenics, which argued that diseases played an important role in eradicating the weaker elements of the population. Haycraft's work illustrates the trend in early Darwinism to emphasise hereditarian determinism and to downplay environmental factors. This emphasis left a considerable unresolved tension. If characteristics, both individual and racial, were inherited through germplasm, or whatever the mechanism might be, as yet unknown when Haycraft was writing, then how to account for evolution, which necessitated the change in somatic forms over time? If such changes did occur, when did population groups separate sufficiently to be called races? And how could one be sure that these races would be sustained, unchanged in perpetuity? Biological determinism, in other words, contradicted the fundamental insight of Darwinism, which is a theory of change. The Jews provided Haycraft with one of his strongest examples, and he turns to them early in the book. Along with the Scandinavian, the Jewish type is one that Haycraft believes to be permanently fixed, and he is impressed by their survival as a race, despite their destruction as a nation. So to quote Haycraft, "So far from this national extinction indicating any race enfeeblement, we have clear proof to the contrary. For to the present day, the Jews are more than fairly represented amongst artists, musicians, scientists, and men of affairs. And in our own mercantile community, with the disadvantage of having 2 holidays in the week against the Gentiles 1, the Jew more than holds his own in the race for wealth." Confirming the insight of Benjamin Kidd, author of Social Evolution, the most popular work of social Darwinism in Britain, that the Jews, along with the Greeks, Armenians, and Italians, have a special liking for dealing and bargaining, and for the more abstract side of financial business, Haycraft typified a stance that recurs time and again in discussions about the Jews, a combination of admiration for their survival and strength, and fear of the threat it supposedly posed to British character traits and society. As an American commentator, James Hosmer, noted, the Jews were, quote, "a people of astonishing power, the wonderful character of whose achievements is hardly possible to exaggerate." This compliment was a double-edged sword, however, as is clear from the uncertain conclusion Hosmer drew from it. Whether the apprehensions of the Germans are reasonable or not, we will not stop to inquire. But what testimony is this to the astonishing power of the Jew, that one of the greatest of modern nations seems to shudder with fear that this fraction of Jews in its population is about to reduce it to subjection? This is 1886, nothing to do with Nazism, by the way. It has become commonplace to note that racial science often merely confirmed long-standing prejudices. It is hardly surprising, then, that in certain quarters this admiration for the Jews' racial qualities spilt over into fear and invective, as in Arnold White's writings, which displayed an exaggerated belief in the Jews' power and influence over world affairs. This kind of paranoia led some commentators to fight back, for example by arguing that the Little Englander attempt to solve the Jewish question in relation to this country alone has a last and fatal defect, which is that legislation cannot prevent migration to an island such as Britain. But even this writer, in stating that it was false to believe that the Jews threatened British interests, turned the stereotype on its head, and suggested, quote, that the tenets of his religion could be set to use for their original purposes of state. I want to turn for a brief section now on Jews and disease, having set the kind of general picture of Jews as a test case for anthropological theory about the origins of different racial groups. I want to say a few words about one of the ways in which that connection was most often appealed to, and that was through discussion about disease. A very well-known and long-standing tradition, which still exists today, of course, now framed in terms of the genetics of conditions such as Tay-Sachs, is the association of Jews with certain diseases. In the 19th century, Jews were supposedly to be especially prone to tuberculosis, certain cancers, and mental illnesses. By contrast, they were also alleged to be immune from alcohol-related illnesses. What these diseases had in common was that they reflected the Jews' long history of confinement to unhealthy ghettos and their addiction to a sedentary scholarly lifestyle that prevented them from developing their muscles and lungs. In the context of the Back to the Land and other hiking and body culture movements that emerged at the turn of the 20th century, Jews sought to escape their supposed condition by founding Jewish hiking, scouting, mountaineering and pioneering groups, echoing trends typical of wider society, in which outdoor-oriented movements, such as the Scouts, became commonplace across all sectors of society. Early Zionism, for example, was shot through with the logic of getting Jews out of Talmudic schools and onto the land in a way that recapitulated common anti-Semitic stereotypes. Under Nazism, the logic of this association was taken to extremes, as Jews were not merely seen as the carriers of diseases such as cholera and typhus, but were themselves regarded as noxious bacteria to be ruthlessly eliminated. But prior to and since Nazism, the links between Jews' health and illness have been regularly investigated. The literature provides, in many respects, the best example of how the racialization process operates historically. No wonder that Beddoe could write that of all white races, the Jews are most likely to reward a careful study of special morbid tendencies, and called for such work to be carried out in detail. In 1857, a man calling himself simply David wrote a heartfelt letter to the Jewish Chronicle on the subject of the prevalence of insanity amongst Jews. David claimed that cases of mental illness amongst Jews were on the rise, and that such illnesses afflicted a higher proportion of the Jewish community than the community at large. The letter attracted the attention of Thomas Hodgkin, the ethnologist, philanthropist, and founder of the Aborigines Protection Society. In tolerant and ecumenical spirit, and with a caring tone typical of his attitudes, Hodgkin wrote the following response to the Jewish Chronicle. My attention has been arrested by an article in the Jewish Chronicle, signed David, which relates to a question which has long been one of interest to me. That's as it was printed in the Jewish Chronicle. I think what he meant was, which has long been one of interest to me. The article is evidently written with a patriotic and benevolent feeling, and the importance of the subject is by no means confined with the Jewish nation. May I therefore solicit space in the Chronicle for a few remarks in relation to it? In the first place, it is very desirable to obtain and carefully examine the statistical data on which David founds his belief that insanity is on the increase among Israelites, and that cases of this afflicting malady exist for a larger proportion amongst them than amongst the community at large. Conclusions not drawn from adequate statistics are very liable to be erroneous. I do not therefore offer any opinion drawn from my own observation as of any value beyond the suggestion of a strong doubt. But Hodgkin's was a voice of moderation that was all too often lacking. Most commentators on the subject of Jews and diseases took it for granted that there was an essential difference between Jews and other races, and thus that it was perfectly reasonable to ask whether it was possible to identify illnesses or diseases which could be considered specifically Jewish, or to which Jews could be said to be naturally resistant. For example, following Joseph Jacobs' famous presentation to the Anthropological Institute on the racial characteristics of modern Jews, the discussion that took place largely turned on two questions: that of the Jews' racial purity, and that of their immunity or propensity towards certain diseases. Marcus Adler, the chief rabbi of the British Empire, confirmed Jacob's assertion that Jews were more prone to insanity than Gentiles, suggesting that the grounds for that phenomenon were to be found in the fact that insanity affected urban dwellers more than rural, and the Jews lived primarily in towns. And Dr. Asher, who had worked as medical officer to the Jewish Board of Guardians, argued, contradicting Jacob's claims, that Jews were exceptionally resistant to phthisis, tuberculosis, implying that this was so primarily as a result of their sanitary living conditions. Throughout the first decades of the 20th century, the correspondence pages of the British medical press often witnessed debates over Jews and disease. One London doctor, writing in the British Medical Journal in 1911, was of the opinion that Jews were better suited to urban dwelling than Gentiles, and was interested in this phenomenon because he feared for the racial well-being of Gentiles currently experiencing the decline of rural Britain. In contrast to British Gentiles, who were undergoing a process of urbanisation, quote, from the debris of disintegrated pastoral and agricultural communities, with all the harrowing phenomena that must accompany a great and sudden change of environment, Jews had long been used to city living. The Jew had shed his alcoholics in the distant past, but remained prone to gastric disorders, enlarged tonsils, adenoid growths, and other troubles associated with nasopharyngeal catarrhs, a result, quote, of the racial evolution of the Jew having taken place in warmer, drier regions than northwest Europe. Would studying the Jew in his modern aspect reveal whether one could hold out any hope, or is back to the land, with our cities abandoned to the Israelite, the only alternative to progressive degeneration? Despite the clear distinction drawn by this doctor between Jews and the British, and even though he deploys the stock note of futural panic with the image of British cities overrun by Jews, the author ends on a more interesting note. I would urge, he writes, that if the study of the Jew can help us in the maintenance of national physique, we should lay aside prejudice and learn, for at present our need is great. Thus, whilst this letter was based on tropes and assumptions that racialised Jews, one would not be justified in ascribing its sentiments simply to anti-Semitism, unless we unpick that term in some detail. Typical of the racialising tendencies of its time though it may be, the solution it offers to the racial health problems supposedly being brought about by rapid urbanisation is to learn from the Jews, for they are already accomplished city dwellers. In the last 2 decades, following a post-Holocaust quarantine period that lasted 5, the question of Jews and disease is once again back on the table. Scientists ask whether certain illnesses can be identified as particularly prevalent amongst Jews, and if so, what the implications of such findings are for our understanding of Jews and Gentiles as biologically separate groups. Remarkably, or not, depending on how accustomed one is to the longevity of these interests, the questions being asked today mirror almost exactly the ones being asked 100 or 200 years ago. They all turn on the assumption that Jews and Gentiles are indeed in some essential way different, and that this difference has not only endured over time, but can be identified for the purposes of medical intervention. Many such studies, for example into the perpetuation of the Y chromosome from the ancient priestly caste down to the present-day Kohanim, presuppose the truthfulness of the biblical narrative as the necessary background for scientific inquiry. Pointing out the existence of such continuities is not to deny that recent efforts to deal with certain diseases prevalent in the Ashkenazi Jewish community, most notably Tay-Sachs disease, but also several other rare but serious genetic conditions, have been worthwhile. Their success results from several factors, including genetic ones and social ones. The former include the so-called founder effect and the bottleneck effect, both of which allow for the relatively easy identification of the conditions, since both involve restricting the number and variety of genes that are available to the group. The latter, social issues, include the willingness of the Jewish community to engage with geneticists with the enthusiastic support of rabbis. This tends to surprise people, but actually, if you read the literature on rabbinic responses to genetics, it fits quite nicely with the long-standing Jewish attitudes towards medicine in general. So we shouldn't be surprised that Jewish religious tradition sits more comfortably, I think, with genetic science than some versions of Christianity do. But equally, recent successes in treating Jewish diseases should not mask the continuities with a long history of association between Jews and illness, an association that has proven powerfully damaging at the level of representations of Jews, but also has the potential to affect the bodies and lives of ordinary people in remarkable ways. It also shows how a focus on certain diseases, because of their supposed ethnic identification, encourages a process of sociological racialization and perhaps even a re-racialization of groups that for 50 years after World War II had not been thought of in those terms, at least not in scholarly circles. It also reveals that the scholarly verbot on such discussions was not solely a result of scientific discovery rendering earlier racial assumptions redundant, but also, perhaps more so, a result of a sense that the political or social dangers posed by such questions outweighed the likely benefits that could accrue to science by asking them. For example, in a particularly virulent outburst that equated Jews with disease, an anonymous author writing in the Pall Mall Gazette ascribed his recent case of smallpox to the arrival in Britain of diseased Jewish immigrants. Referring to Jews as, quote, loathsome wretches who came grunting and itching to our shores, the author then went on, the smallpox now creeping through London, this agony now throbbing and scorching in my arm, is caused, make no mistake about it, by the scum washed to our shores in the dirty waters flowing from foreign drain pipes. That's from 1901. This sort of statement, which equates Jews with disease, is of course different from a discussion of diseases specific to Jews, but in practice, the two discourses have proved difficult to disentangle. Both legitimise a linkage of Jews and disease, which, as with the racialisation of other groups, suggests that Jews are biologically different from other peoples and carries implications of segregation or worse. It would be wrong to, I think even for a lecture on race theory, to end by suggesting that there were no critics of racial logic. But those who did not see the world through racial lenses were few and far between. I think from the period 1850 to 1950, race was simply part of people's mental makeup. It was how people understood the world. And so critics of race were really outstanding pioneers in some ways. Some criticised the notion that Jews could be racially identified and argued instead by appealing to religion. The fact is, Charles Grant wrote, if you want to lay your hand on the infidel and perfidious Jew, you cannot do better than keep to the baptismal register. Others are relevant to us here, although they did not discuss Jews, merely because of their resistance to racial logic. William Dalton Babington, for example, focused on Anglo-Irish relations, arguing, I cannot believe in the existence of any well-defined race, either in England or Ireland, and hence, if there be no distinct races, their differences must arise from other than racial causes. In the case of the different conditions of England and Ireland, Babington believed that they were, quote, sufficiently accounted for by long-continued differences of environment, local position, convenience or remoteness, climate and soil, social influences, legislation and administration of the law, political history and religion or its absence. These are true and sufficient causes, and there is no reason for imagining any other. Such examples illustrate the fact that it was possible to think outside of the racializing mainstream of the 19th century. However, whether dealing specifically with the Jews or when it came to thinking about racial origins per se, such views were decidedly in the minority. Just a few words by way of conclusion. Susan Martha Kahn writes, it is certainly problematic when it's considered socially relevant to conflate biological inheritance with cultural inheritance, to claim that locating common DNA translates into some form of immutable cultural and or religious affinity. Besides, as she points out, Jewish identity is not reckoned via genetics in most contemporary rabbinic discourse. There's a famous quotation from Tudor Parfit where he says, Jewishness is not a matter of DNA, nor can DNA be used to prove or disprove an individual's or group's Jewishness. Besides, as Kahn points out, Jewish identity... I've already given you that quotation. Kahn cites the rabbinical ruling that if a Jewish woman gestates a fetus that was conceived with an egg donated by a non-Jewish woman, then the child will be Jewish, because the woman carrying the fetus is Jewish. Thus, for contemporary rabbis, Jewishness is not conferred genetically. As Kahn notes, if Jewishness is not believed to have a genetic component, then using contemporary genetic research to make claims about Jewish historical solidarity or biblical origins suggests a peculiar kind of methodological confusion. Whilst genealogy is important to Judaism, genetics is not necessary for establishing Jewishness. Still, for most secular scholars, appealing to a rabbinical definition of Jewishness is equally unsatisfactory as appealing to geneticists, other than from a multicultural point of view which is comfortable with any community's self-definition. However certain rabbis define Jewishness, many Jews and non-Jews remain wedded to a notion of belonging through blood that suggests a powerful role for genetic knowledge. Thus, it remains essential to highlight some of the methodological inconsistencies at the base of such research, not least devoting resources and dedicating rational scientific knowledge in order to provide scientific proof of ancient narratives, for the very raison d'etre of such studies is deeply contentious. Indeed, whilst at best they offer entertaining distractions from serious research for scientists, at worst they dangerously recapitulate the racist logic they think they are exposing. One such danger is that, quote, diagnostic practices at the population level have previously threatened to entrench forms of pathology at the biological level without delivering promised relief through the discovery of cures. That comes from Sharon Snyder and David Mitchell on the racial genome. Directing research towards race-specific drugs runs the risk of validating the existence of biological races that were created by race science in the 18th and 19th century on the basis of simplistic and scientifically meaningless visual differences, and whose sociological afterlife is the only criterion of their effectiveness, though we should note that there has been quite some effectiveness, in creating and perpetuating power relations, prejudices, and fears. In other words, racial medicine may be with us once more, paradoxically combining modern genetic techniques with fairy tales of racial difference. The history of the idea of race is full of proofs of the power of magic and superstition in the modern world, even at the heart of the supposedly rational world of science. In that sense, then, race remains a subject for anthropologists, no longer as scholars seeking to account for physical differences between human population groups, but as scholars trying to explain the power of non-rational ideas in modern societies. Historicising the idea of race will leave us better prepared to think critically about the claims put forward by scientists, whose scientific practice most of us cannot understand in the humanities, concerning the origins of population groups and racial profiling for medical, insurance, and other potentially more nefarious practices. Over 100 years ago, in one of the pioneering anti-racist works, Jean Finot confined race to the dustbin of worn-out ideas. This is from 1911. The false conception attached to the word race and the evil effects of this on the relations between nation, and even between man and man, ought indeed long ago to have gone the way of many other superstitions, for which a grave is already dug in that great cemetery wherein lie buried all the worn-out intellectual conceptions of the past. Yet the term remains with us. In some ways, its effects are as pernicious as ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that panoramic view of a mix of science and pseudoscience and religion and medicine. We have time for questions and comments. Dan will be happy to answer and respond. So if you do have a question or a comment, please put your hand up and I'll try to notice you. Sir.
You touched on DNA, but didn't go too far into it. Very often there seems to be a lot of discussion on DNA and particular groups having particular DNA. Has that made any difference? I mean, is there any reality to that? And has it made much difference to race theory and anthropology?
Should I answer that? Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly DNA is a real thing that really exists. What I think is so interesting is when scientists use non-scientific categories such as descriptions of races that come from philology and ethnology in the 18th and 19th century in order to then investigate, as if you like, the presupposing research questions for their research into DNA. So through the study of DNA, I think it's fairly clear, insofar as I understand it, that one can establish that different population groups around the world have slightly different codes of DNA to a very small extent. But the problem is if you start from a point of view of trying to discover a particular racial group with using definitions of race that come from an earlier period, you then mix up two different categories, and you end up with something that, although the research might be identifying certain differences in human population groups, does not necessarily correspond to racial categories as they were provided two centuries ago, let's say. For starters, 99% of all human DNA is shared with monkeys, right? So that leaves only 1% that is specifically human. Within that 1%, it's obvious that certain population groups have certain bits of DNA that other groups don't. Is that enough to mean that we can then divide human populations up into separate races? I don't think so, and I don't think biological anthropologists or biologists in general think so either. It might mean that you can target specific population groups to some extent for certain medical treatments, but it shouldn't, I think, be used to replicate racial categories that come from a different way of thinking.
There's a gentleman in a black sweater.
Thank you. You mentioned that there were very few opponents to the idea of racial science in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. There must have been Jewish anthropologists and ethnologists at this time. Did they not oppose the prevailing ideas? What were their responses to the kinds of ideas that were prevailing about Jews?
It's a very nice question, and I didn't discuss it here because it's a separate topic. I have actually written a bit about this elsewhere and done more research on it. I mentioned Joseph Jacobs. He's probably the most famous of the Jewish race scientists in this country, an Australian who came to London and who was the editor of the... he then moved to New York to become the editor of the Encyclopedia Judaica, but he gave a number of talks, including one that I mentioned in passing on the racial characteristics of the Jews and many others. There were many. He was probably the most famous British race scientist, but there were many Jewish race scientists in the early 20th century, mainly German, Arthur Rupin and others. I've written a paper on another British race scientist, Redcliffe Salomon, extremely interesting man actually, and what all of these, they all have slightly different views, but what they all have in common is precisely that they do not do what you're suggesting. That's to say, they're also people of their time. They believed in the existence of race, and they also sought to respond to what they saw as an anti-Semitic strand in race theory by showing actually that the racial origins and characteristics of the Jews were such that could be admired or were likely to be worthwhile in some way. So in the discourse of eugenics, for example, you get this notion of the Jews having survived for so long despite their many periods of adversity because the strongest had survived. The ability to survive through the ghettos and the pogroms and so on meant that only the strongest in the race had managed to win through. And this has to do with the notion of kashrut, of hygiene laws, and so on and so forth, all of which suggest that the Jews are somehow a uniquely eugenic people, avant la lettre. But you also, in general, what you see is that the Jewish race scientists were also, were in no ways opponents of race thinking. Salomon is a good example. Redcliffe Salomon is an interesting man because he was first and foremost a potato geneticist. His papers in Cambridge are fantastic. They're full of these comparisons between potatoes and people. Because he worked with Bateson in Cambridge at the early part. He was one of the first proper geneticists in this country after the rediscovery of Mendel's laws in 1900. And Salomon was actually quite important because he discovered various blight-resistant strains of potato which was important as a response to the Irish potato famine and so on. He also wrote a book called The Social and Cultural History of the Potato, which sounds a relatively arcane work, but has been continuously in print since 1949, which is not something you can say for very many books. It's an extremely important work of cultural history. But Salomon, at the same time as he identified various blight-resistant strains of potatoes, was also, partly because of his Jewish origin, he was obsessed with the racial origins of the Jews. And he thought that you could, this is long before the discovery of DNA, obviously, he thought that you could ascribe Jewish characteristics to simple Mendelian traits. So he collected, like Galton did, lots of photographs of Jewish types, if you like, and he published, I think it was in 1911, 2 articles in the Journal of Genetics. One was on potatoes, and one was on Jews, and in both he made the same argument, which is that the characteristics of potatoes and the characteristics of Jews could be explained as simple Mendelian traits. And what he refers to as the Jewish facial characteristics, he says, is a simple recessive Mendelian gene. And when you read this now, of course, it's great to read. It's bonkers, but it made sense to him at the time, given the level of genetic knowledge. So there were lots of Jewish race scientists. To some extent, they did see themselves as engaged in a kind of defence against anti-Semitic race science, but they did so from within the parameters set by that science. Not many of them escaped it.
There's a woman just in front of you. And then...
I can't understand about Jewish race, because you've got Japanese, Chinese, African, the ones in Argentina, Gauchos, and everyone's completely different.
Mm-hmm.
How does one define a Jewish race?
Mm-hmm. How does one define a race at all, in that sense? We can see by looking around the room that people look different from one another, can't we? But the idea of a race, that's say as a stable, discrete, biologically separate group of human beings different from another group of human beings doesn't make sense, because we know it's not true. Because all human beings can interbreed. There's no clear demarcation line. There are inclines, if you like. Shades of colour merge into one another. Shapes of the eyes and so on merge into one another. We can't draw clear, distinct lines between population groups. The point is, at the time, let's say from the early 19th century through to the early 20th, most race theorists tended to divide the world's peoples up into 4 or 5 major racial types: Caucasian, Negroid, Mongoloid, sometimes Australasian, sometimes Malay, and these different. And within that, you then had subgroups. And Semites, which included the Jews, were usually reckoned to be a subgroup of Caucasians, right? Go on.
But Semites are Arabic, aren't they? They're Arabs.
Semite is a linguistic term.
Yes.
Right, ultimately, it doesn't mean anything biologically speaking. That's precisely the point. But the relevance of the Jews at this time was that, I think this is what I was trying to show, they were considered a kind of test case. The anthropologists were interested in general in racial origins. The Jews were a test case precisely because they'd supposedly maintained their racial purity for 2,000 years, and yet they somehow looked like the people amongst whom they lived everywhere around the world. I mean, it's not hard to work out why. But at the time, because the Jewish law says that Jews don't marry out, all these prudish British race scientists said, oh well, of course the Jews don't marry out, so how could it possibly be that they look like the surrounding population? So then you get all these debates about climate and so on. And so the Jews are interesting, even more so than other cases that you've given, that you've mentioned, because of their longevity and their supposed racial purity. They, in a sense, although they're only a small group numerically, they embody all the different issues that anthropologists are obsessed with at this point in time.
There's a question in the middle of this row here. Yes.
When you were talking about...
If you just hang on, if the mic will come.
When you were talking about the 19th century, it was almost as if there was some sort of idea that there was no original pure Jew, and what had happened in the meantime to dilute or contaminate or whatever.
Mhm.
I wondered how you thought that current work on DNA had affected that. I don't know anything about human DNA, but I'm thinking of horses, for instance, that looking at groups of primitive horses, they seem to have more variety than, say, modern Icelandic horses. So the Jews, by being forced out of normal majority society and imposing their own isolation too, could have created a more discrete group of DNA. Would you like to say something about
I'm not sure that it works like that, precisely for the reason that I was just explaining, which is it's obvious that, of course, Jews have interbred with surrounding populations. I mean, that is why you have Jews with fair hair and blue eyes in Scandinavia and brown skin in India and so on. It's not, I think, as Beddoe would argue, that all these different traits existed in the original racial type, whatever on earth that means. So I think you can find a bit of both. On the one hand, the ability, let's say, to identify Tay-Sachs disease as a problem not unique to, but predominantly of the Ashkenazi Jewish community, has to do with the founder effect. That's to say that there's this genetic mutation occurred at an ancestor a long time ago, and the number of ancestors that have come from that person remain relatively small in world terms. So you can test within a certain population group with some accuracy for that disease. On the other hand, I don't think it's like Icelandic horses in that Jews have bred out with other people around the world. So that, I mean, this is one of, I think, the problems with this sort of DNA research is that it relies on cultural definitions or religious definitions of a group in order to carry out biological research, and conflates the two categories. So that it identifies people who, let's say, self-identify as a Cohen, as a descendant of the priestly caste from the days of the temple, but doesn't test people who are descended from someone who might have been Jewish 4 generations ago but no longer think of themselves as Jewish. These people are lost, if you like, to the study. So the genetics has not, I think, of the Jews, hasn't remained narrow or become narrow in the manner of horses. I think the scientists who work on this select particular self-identifying groups. Does that make sense? I'm not a scientist.
Well,
so
anyone who does Jewish genealogy knows that most of the 19th century Jews have more non-Jewish descendants than Jewish. So that's
yes,
what
exactly.
you're saying. It's
Exactly.
a self-selecting group.
Exactly
It's
so.
a label.
Yeah, this is part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, we see that in the late 19th century, before the waves of immigration from Eastern Europe, in Britain and in France and in Germany, levels of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews were extremely high. But suddenly you have these race scientists talking as if what's going on around them isn't really the case. It's quite bizarre.
You mentioned that some 19th century anthropologists exaggerate Jewish attributes and Jewish eugenics. In the political sphere, during the First World War, as we know, the warring nations hugely exaggerate what they see as Jewish power, with a view, for example, to Jewish influence, bringing the United States into the war, with a view to recognition of political Zionism in relation to Palestine. Do we see any connection, do you think, between this race science and the way that perhaps it was interpreted in a political context?
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much. There are a number of people who put their hands in the air, so I think we'll gather up a few questions and then we'll go back to Dan and I'll try to reach all of you. There was a gentleman just...
You just asked my question, so...
I was wondering about how thinking about race theory in the particular historical moment that you did makes it difficult, particularly if we begin to think about it as kind of crazy or difficult or somehow fanciful, to recognize just how powerful and enduring racial thinking was. Not only in Germany, but in the whole eugenics movement, which was the common sense of the social and human sciences in the LSE, probably if Birkbeck existed at the time. So the kind of power of race thinking tends to be and the way in which xenophobic thinking in the present draws back on questions of race.
Yes.
So issues of race can return in the present very powerfully. So there seems to be something kind of uneasy about the ease with which we kind of poke fun or think of these kind of earlier scientific thinking within particular kind of historical moments. There seems almost something kind of not only uneasy but kind of intellectually questionable in the kind of historiography that then makes it harder for us to think about, well, why is it now in the present that racist thinking in terms of the refugee crisis, in terms of what's happening in Germany, in terms of different movements that are emerging around Europe, that racial thinking is still very much part of the present.
Thank you very much. There's a question. There's a gentleman here. If you could just pass the mic to the front here, and then we'll go back to Dan and take another round if there are more people who want to speak.
Yeah, the academics who are coming up with these sort of these racial theories 100, 200 years ago, yeah, they were pretty bright people, and they had their theories, and I just wonder, how much, and yet today we sort of, because of the Nazi experience, it seems to me we've sort of gone from one extreme to another. I mean, from saying, being interested in race, because it's pretty obvious, we all see race, and now because of the Nazi experience, we've sort of gone to the other extreme of saying it doesn't exist. And I just wonder how sort of scientific that is. I mean, your tone is a bit sort of moral, I mean, race is rubbish, doesn't exist. So that sort of comes through. And it seems to me that we've gone from one extreme to the other.
Fine.
Thank you. Dan.
Let me take the first question first, because I think it's quite clear there is obviously a connection between race science and the political context and the context of Jewish power, because this partly does answer the other two questions. That you often see this, that what race science does is to provide apparently scientific answers to commonly held views, or to confirm commonly held views. So lo and behold, lots of scientists conclude that Jews are more intelligent than Gentiles, that they have a particular aptitude for business, and so on and so forth. This is something that then becomes scientifically proven. And you're absolutely right. So you see this certainly in the context of the First World War and the Balfour Declaration and so on, but most importantly in the Second World War. Somewhat ironically, I think, towards the end of the Second World War, when the Nazis realise they're going to lose the war, they then start trying to for example, in the negotiations in Hungary in the spring of 1944, they imagine that these local Jewish leaders that they're dealing with in Budapest have some connection to the world Jewish conspiracy, and so they think that they better take them seriously when they're negotiating with them, which works to the advantage of the Jews who are negotiating, who pretend to have more power than they do in order to, if you like, play with the Nazis' notion of Jewish world power. So it's certainly that there's a connection. I think that also, with a different hat on, when I'm writing about the Holocaust, that explains for me the difference between Nazi attitudes towards the Jews and to other population groups who they attack. In that, I think that groups such as the Roma, for example, gypsies, are also victims of genocide as a Nazi policy. But the Nazis regard gypsies as a kind of polluting or unaesthetic people. They're dirty and they're in the way, and they're subhuman, and we need to get rid of them. But they're frightened of the Jews. They regard the Jews as some kind of malicious, dangerous threat to the Aryan race. And there's this different order of understanding the world going on, I think, in Nazi views. So the answer to your questions is yes. The other two questions are clearly related to one another. Your question is a kind of answer to this one, in the sense that there are people who still think that race exists. I mean, the moral tone that came through suggesting that race doesn't exist is because it doesn't. I mean, that's precisely my point. Race doesn't exist. As I said, we can look around the room, and when we see race, as you put it, what we see are differences in human characteristics that are obvious in terms of skin colour and so on. But is that a difference in race, not in the sense that is meant by these people at this time?
But it's very important to us because we're a tribal
It is.
animal.
It's important. That's
And
exactly.
even if we don't see differences, we invent them.
Right, that's the answer to that question. Race continues to be important sociologically. It's not important biologically. There are a few maverick biologists, most of whom have connections to Mankind Quarterly and other Nazi organisations, who continue to maintain that race is really something that exists. But in terms of what race was originally meant to mean, i.e. A discrete, identifiable, stable population group that could not breed with another stable, discrete human population group, it doesn't not exist. But the point is that race continues to be, and this is why I ended on this way, continues to have pernicious effects because, for lots of reasons. As you say, if you like, we're tribal, we look around, we identify with certain groups, and so we behave as if race exists. And what I find troubling, and I don't know what the answer or solution to this problem is that race, the existence of race has to some extent been perpetuated by the discourse of anti-racism. Because we continue to call people out for racism, thereby suggesting that race is a real thing that continues to exist. And that is a serious problem, I think. I don't really know what the way...
Well, if I could just add something that, that it's not a term in popular parlance, but certainly sociologists who talk about these issues now often don't talk about racism or anti-racism. They talk about something which they call racialization, which is that process exactly of turning difference into
something harder.
Into something harder, maybe something biological. So, I think...
exactly. Yeah.
Are there any other... Sir, yeah.
Thank you. Well, I certainly agree with you about the anti-racist discourse. I think part of the problem is the overuse and misuse of the word racist, where it actually should not be used. But could you tell us something about the two versions of the UNESCO statement on race? Because one version, well, you know about that, but it was revised after scientific protest. So could you just say something about that?
Insofar as I remember about it, the first version was 1950, wasn't it? Is that right? 50? Maybe someone could correct me. I think it was 1950, the first UNESCO statement on race, and the second one followed a couple of years later. And you're absolutely right. And this also speaks to the last two questions, in that, and something I also said at the end of the lecture, which is that if you like, the suppression of discussing race was, as you say, a result of the Holocaust to a large extent. But the discussions that took place amongst anthropologists and biologists as part of the background to the UNESCO statements on race make it very clear that many of the scientists involved did not have their minds changed by what had happened during World War II. And I can understand that. I don't see the Holocaust as a logical outcome of race science. I think it emerges from a kind of race thinking in Nazi Germany, but not one that is purely a scientific discourse. So there were lots of scientists who said, well, what the Nazis did was wrong, but that doesn't invalidate the concept of race as such, and we should continue to work on it. Whereas other scientists who said, actually, no, what we can see now is that all race is nonsense. They kind of won the day, but the revision was brought about because there were so many scientists who had their doubts. And again, I think what's important is to remember that this change of heart was also made before the discovery of DNA and before the idea that race as a biologically definable concept could be deconstructed in the way that it can be today. So this, I think what you're getting at, again, is to relate to the last questions, this notion that the idea of race hadn't disappeared, that we have this statement, but that somehow it also contributed to the perpetuation of race. I think what the UNESCO statements did, in a sense, was to push race out of the laboratories and into the sociology departments. And so it allowed for the continuation of discourse on race, but in a slightly different context. I got this book out of my bag when you were asking the question, and I forgot to quote from it. I'm having a Jonathan Coe season at home at the moment, and this book, The Rotters Club, is about growing up in Birmingham in the 70s, so it has some resonances for me. And this is in the context of what you call him, Rivers of Blood,
Enoch Powell.
Enoch Powell's famous speech, and the narrator describes the language of pure racism as a kind of malign talismanic potency. That was, if you like, the answer to your question. Racism has a kind of malign talismanic potency, which I think continues to seduce people. It offers violent and simple ways of understanding the world and ways of not having to engage with other people by simply saying, no, these people are different, inferior, dangerous, etc., etc. That, I think, in a sense, explains the continued existence of race thinking in our world. We like to think of ourselves as rational, but we're also the anthropologists in 100 years will also look back at us and think, what on earth were they talking about?
But then the state chooses to...
I'm sorry. I think that notion of race as malign, talismanic, and also potent is a suitably dark moment for us to end on. Before we end, I'd like to thank all of you who have contributed to this extremely lively and stimulating discussion. I'll thank Dan in just a moment. Before I do, let me remind you that you have an opportunity for a mere $4.99 to buy this path-breaking adornment to your homes. But most important of all, I would like to thank Dan for really an illuminating lecture which illumines both our fascination, our collective fascinations with issues around similarity and difference, and the ways in which these concerns of ours have often been frozen, and ideas of difference have been reified in dangerous conceptions of race. Thank you very much.
Thank you.